The confidential surrogacy agreement lay open beside Maya Sterling's red leather lab notebook. Isabella Vance's name appeared on the final page in elegant black lettering. Julian Sterling stood across the laboratory conference table in a charcoal executive suit, speaking as if he were presenting a quarterly strategy instead of dismantling a marriage. Isabella, dressed in an ivory designer's suit, sat quietly beside him as the proposed future of the Sterling legacy. Then Maya saw something that mattered more than Isabella's name. Embedded within the agreement was a DNA archive identifier. Her identifier, a reference linked directly to years of private genetic research stored under her authority. Julian was not simply proposing a surrogate. He had already woven Maya's life's work into a plan designed to replace her. In that moment, she understood the structure of the betrayal. The surrogate was never the point. Ownership was. Then she stood. Maya did not argue. She did not ask questions whose answers were already sitting on the table. She picked up the red notebook and left the laboratory conference suite before Julian could continue explaining his version of the future. The private elevator carried her down 27 floors to the secured research archive. By the time the doors opened, the shock had already begun transforming into inventory. She entered her authorization credentials and accessed the original patent architecture files connected to Sterling Bio's flagship DNA platforms. Thousands of pages appeared across multiple protected databases. Maya ignored the headlines and summaries. She searched for one thing only: control. Secure the archive. She reviewed activation sequences. She reviewed licensing dependencies. She reviewed manufacturing permissions attached to every major research program carrying the Sterling Bio name. The deeper she looked, the clearer the truth became. Julian owned facilities. Julian owned laboratories. Julian owned investor relationships. But critical activation authority remained connected to patent structures created and controlled by her original research framework. That mattered. She continued reviewing the chain of authorization attached to each licensed platform. Several billion-dollar programs depended on validation pathways that originated inside her intellectual property ecosystem. If those pathways were challenged, entire development schedules could stall. If licensing rights were reviewed, partners would demand answers. Run the review. Maya opened another file. Then another. Every discovery confirmed the same pattern. Julian had spent years convincing himself that the Sterling name generated value. The records showed something different. The value began with invention. The value began with authorship. The value began with the work he could never replicate. He had miscalculated. Near midnight, Maya drafted a confidential authorization request and transmitted it to the licensing officer responsible for external patent compliance. The request did not revoke anything. Not yet. It initiated a formal review process regarding foundational activation rights and ownership validation. A simple procedural step. A devastating one if the findings supported what she already knew. She attached supporting documentation. She preserved every timestamp. She documented every reference number connected to her original research. Protect the source. When the transmission was complete, Maya closed the red leather notebook and rested her hand on its cover for a single moment. Julian believed he had just secured the future of his empire. Maya had just begun verifying whether that empire could legally function without the woman he intended to replace. The research archive remained open long after midnight, but Maya Sterling was no longer looking at patent structures. The screens glowed across the room while she sat alone beside a temperature-controlled storage cabinet containing the earliest versions of her genetic sequencing work. For years, this room had represented possibility, discovery, progress. Tonight, it represented something else. She opened a secured file containing laboratory records from nearly a decade earlier and found the original DNA framework that eventually became the foundation of Sterling Bio's most profitable platform. Her name appeared on every page. So did Julian's. Handwritten notes in the margins. Back then, he had called her brilliant. Back then, he had said they were building something together. Maya studied the documents for several silent minutes. Then she opened the surrogacy agreement again and placed it beside the research file. The comparison was devastating in its simplicity. One document celebrated her mind. The other reduced her existence to biological utility. Then she understood. The deepest wound was not Isabella. Isabella was only a symptom. The real injury was realizing that Julian no longer saw a wife, a partner, or even a scientist. He saw an asset that could be replaced if a more convenient version appeared. He had looked at years of sacrifice, innovation, and loyalty and decided that none of it mattered more than preserving his image of control. Maya closed her eyes briefly. Not from grief. From clarity. The moment passed. Opened the notebook. She turned to the red leather lab notebook resting beside her and began reviewing entries from the years when Sterling Bio was still a fragile startup operating out of borrowed laboratory space. She remembered weekends spent sleeping on office couches. She remembered 70-hour research weeks. She remembered solving crises that investors never knew existed. Every breakthrough that transformed the company had started with one recurring pattern. Julian encountered a wall. Maya found a solution. The realization carried no satisfaction, only precision. She had spent years protecting a man who secretly resented needing her. That was enough. Near 2 in the morning, Maya accessed another protected database and reviewed the ownership architecture connected to her patents. She examined licensing authority clauses, activation requirements, validation protocols, and intellectual property dependencies. Each layer reinforced the same conclusion. Sterling Bio did not merely use her inventions. It depended on them. Entire manufacturing pipelines required patent validation originating from frameworks she personally controlled. Entire research programs operated inside systems she designed. Verify ownership. Maya began creating a private inventory of every critical dependency connected to her intellectual property. She documented authorization chains. She preserved licensing histories. She archived correspondence establishing scientific authorship. The process felt almost clinical. Yet beneath the discipline, something important was changing. Earlier that evening, she had been trying to understand why Julian betrayed her. Now she was asking a different question. Why had she spent so long protecting someone who feared her strengths more than he valued them? The answer arrived quietly. Because she believed partnership meant carrying weight together. Julian believed partnership meant ownership. The difference had finally become impossible to ignore. Around dawn, a notification appeared confirming receipt of her confidential review request. The licensing officer had formally opened the validation process. No accusations had been made. No licenses had been revoked. No public consequences had begun. Yet Maya understood exactly what had changed. For the first time in years, she was no longer defending Sterling Bio from the consequences of Julian's decisions. She was protecting the truth of her own work. Protect the source. As sunlight slowly touched the upper windows of the archive, Maya closed the final file and secured the notebook inside her briefcase. The marriage was already over in every way that mattered. What remained was the future. And for the first time in a very long time, that future belonged entirely to her. 3 days after the licensing review began, Maya Sterling stopped thinking like a betrayed wife and returned to thinking like the scientist who had built the foundation of an entire biotechnology empire. The distinction mattered. Emotions could explain the past. Systems controlled the future. She spent her mornings inside a private research facility located nearly 12 miles from Sterling Bio headquarters, surrounded by secure archives, patent records, genomic datasets, and years of developmental research. What she needed now was not revenge. What she needed was a complete map of reality. Open the notebook. The red leather lab notebook contained more than research observations. It contained the intellectual architecture beneath Sterling Bio's most valuable technologies. Maya began tracing how each commercial platform depended on her original genetic sequencing frameworks. Every major product followed the same chain. A patent generated an activation sequence. The activation sequence enabled validation protocols. Validation protocols supported manufacturing permissions. Manufacturing permissions allowed commercial deployment. Remove the source, and the structure became unstable. Every clinical validation pathway depended on genomic reference models Maya had personally designed years earlier. The manufacturing licenses attracted headlines, but the deeper vulnerability lived inside the validation architecture itself. If independent reviewers questioned ownership of those models, research timelines could stall across multiple programs simultaneously. A billion-dollar laboratory could not manufacture credibility. It had to inherit it from verified science. Document everything. Maya reviewed licensing agreements. clinical validation records, laboratory certification dependencies, and regulatory submission histories one by one. Many external partners believed they were licensing technology from Sterling Bio, but several clinical programs were actually built on genomic reference models, validation thresholds, and source sequence permissions Maya had created before the company became powerful. That distinction had never mattered before because she had never challenged the arrangement. Now it mattered immensely. Preserve that. Maya created detailed dependency charts showing how research facilities, manufacturing programs, clinical development schedules, regulatory pathways, and international licensing agreements intersected with her intellectual property. It was also revealing. Entire departments operated on assumptions rather than verified ownership analysis. Julian had spent years expanding aggressively, convinced that scale itself created permanence. Maya understood something he never fully appreciated. In biotechnology, value did not begin with buildings, investors, or branding. Value began with protected discovery. Without defensible science, everything else became presentation. Meanwhile, across Sterling Bio headquarters, Julian continued presenting confidence to investors, journalists, and board representatives. Publicly, he spoke about innovation, legacy, and the future of biotechnology. Privately, a different pattern emerged. Whenever discussions drifted toward the origins of the company's foundational patents, Julian redirected the conversation toward corporate growth metrics. Whenever technical experts referenced Maya's early breakthroughs, he emphasized the Sterling brand instead. Whenever questions approached scientific authorship, he changed subjects. Maya noticed every instance through reports reaching her from industry contacts. He had miscalculated. The behavior exposed something deeper than arrogance. Julian could tolerate competition. He could tolerate criticism. What he could not tolerate was the possibility that people might discover the truth. The truth was simple. Sterling Bio's greatest breakthroughs had never originated from him. For years, Maya had protected him from that reality by allowing success to remain collective. Now she saw how desperately he needed the illusion to survive. Protect the source. By the end of the week, Maya completed a comprehensive intellectual property dependency review and secured copies within multiple protected archives. Every authorization pathway was documented. Every licensing relationship was cataloged. Every activation sequence was verified. She was not preparing an attack. She was preparing evidence. The distinction mattered, because when the system eventually began asking difficult questions, answers would matter more than anger. As she closed the final file that evening, Maya looked once more at the diagrams connecting years of research to billions of dollars in commercial value. Julian believed power came from controlling the Sterling name. Maya now understood his greatest fear. Deep down, he knew the name had never been the source of the empire. He was terrified the world would discover who truly built it. Arrogance is a blindfold that makes powerful men believe they can own the light while discarding the sun. The dangerous thing about that belief is not its cruelty. It is its fragility. Because eventually reality begins asking questions that confidence alone cannot answer. Julian Sterling had spent years standing in rooms where investors, journalists, and executives treated him like the architect of the future. Over time, he began believing the applause belonged to him alone. He forgot something important. Applause follows results. Results follow creation. And creation cannot be inherited simply because someone controls the building where it happened. Maya Sterling understood that now with greater clarity than ever before. The betrayal had not destroyed her. It had removed an illusion. That was different. No more permission. A week after completing her intellectual property review, Maya arrived at a private research campus located outside the city. The facility belonged to an independent scientific consortium specializing in advanced genomic innovation. Unlike Sterling Bio headquarters, there were no oversized portraits celebrating founders. No carefully managed displays of corporate prestige. The culture revolved around one thing only: evidence. Maya rented a secured laboratory suite and began rebuilding the professional life she had postponed for years while helping Julian expand his empire. The transition was surprisingly quiet. She met with research directors. She reviewed collaborative opportunities. She evaluated emerging projects that had been ignored by larger corporations because they offered long-term scientific value rather than immediate publicity. For the first time in years, every conversation centered on science rather than image. Protect the source. During the following days, Maya established relationships with licensing specialists, university research programs, and independent biotechnology groups familiar with her earlier work. Many of them already knew her name. Some had cited her research. Others had built entire studies using methodologies she developed years earlier. None of them seemed surprised when she appeared without Sterling Bio attached to her introduction. Several research directors openly discussed projects that had stalled years earlier because corporate timelines favored marketability over scientific rigor. Maya listened carefully. For the first time in years, she was surrounded by people evaluating ideas before evaluating branding. The conversations felt unfamiliar at first. Then they felt liberating. Nobody asked whose name would appear on a building. They asked whether the science worked. Build the future. That detail stayed with her. Julian had always insisted the company created her influence. Yet here, influence existed without the company. Reputation existed without the brand. Respect existed without the Sterling name. The realization felt less like validation and more like freedom. Meanwhile, reports from industry contacts continued arriving. Sterling Bio remained outwardly strong. Investor confidence appeared stable. Product announcements continued. Interviews continued. Public messaging remained carefully controlled. Yet Maya noticed subtle shifts beneath the surface. Increasingly, technical discussions were being filtered through marketing teams. Increasingly, questions regarding foundational patents were answered with corporate language instead of scientific explanations. Most people overlooked the difference. Maya did not. She recognized the signs of a system relying more heavily on presentation than substance. He had miscalculated. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposed collaborative project involving next-generation genomic diagnostics, Maya paused to study the sunlight crossing her laboratory desk. The red leather notebook rested beside a stack of research proposals awaiting evaluation. For years, she had associated that notebook with responsibility, with sacrifice, with survival. Now it represented something else. Possibility. The future no longer depended on preserving Julian's ambitions. It depended on deciding what she wanted to build next. Open the doors. And for the first time since the surrogacy agreement appeared on that conference table, the answer felt larger than revenge. It felt like purpose. 2 weeks later, Julian Sterling stood beneath the white lights of the North American Bioinnovation Forum, surrounded by investors, journalists, and industry leaders who still viewed Sterling Bio as one of the most influential biotechnology companies in the country. Giant digital displays rotated through images of future therapies, genomic breakthroughs, and expansion plans worth billions of dollars. Everything looked exactly the way Julian wanted it to look. Controlled, ambitious, unstoppable. Isabella Vance stood beside him in an elegant pearl-white dress, perfectly positioned for cameras that followed their every movement. The media loved the story. The celebrated biotech billionaire. The glamorous future of the Sterling legacy. The next chapter of innovation. On the surface, Julian appeared to have won. He spoke confidently during interviews. He moved through networking events with practiced ease. He shook hands. He posed for photographs. He accepted praise as naturally as breathing. Yet beneath the polished performance, small fractures were beginning to appear. One journalist asked a routine question about the scientific origins of Sterling Bio's flagship DNA platform. Julian answered by discussing market expansion. Another asked about future licensing partnerships. He redirected the conversation toward corporate growth. A third referenced foundational research published years earlier under Maya's leadership. For a brief moment, the confidence in his expression tightened. Then he changed the subject entirely. Not now. Most people missed the reaction. Industry veterans did not. Neither did the board representative observing from across the room. Julian continued presenting his vision during a private investor session later that afternoon. Charts filled massive screens. Revenue forecasts stretched years into the future. Expansion plans reached across continents. The presentation was flawless. Yet whenever technical details emerged, Julian deferred to prepared summaries instead of engaging directly with the science. He spoke comfortably about ownership, less comfortably about invention. The distinction was subtle. It was also revealing. He had miscalculated. Meanwhile, Isabella embraced the spotlight with increasing confidence. Interviews described her as the public face of a modern biotech dynasty. Lifestyle publications featured her. Luxury brands courted her. Event organizers positioned her beside Julian during every major appearance. To outsiders, she looked like the perfect successor to the image Maya once occupied. But image was the key word. During one private discussion, a senior investor casually asked Isabella about the research initiative she had recently endorsed online. She offered a polished answer that contained no scientific substance. The conversation ended politely. The investor's interest ended with it. Appearances could attract attention. They could not replace expertise. Across the industry, Maya's absence was creating an unexpected effect. The more Sterling Bio tried to move forward without acknowledging her contributions, the more people quietly began discussing them. Research directors remembered her presentations. Scientists remembered her publications. Licensing specialists remembered her authorship. Her reputation continued circulating through professional networks without any effort from her at all. Protect the source. That evening, Julian attended an invitation-only reception reserved for major industry figures. As conversations unfolded around him, he noticed something he had spent years avoiding. When people praised Sterling Bio's greatest achievements, they often mentioned Maya's name before his. Sometimes indirectly, sometimes openly. The pattern irritated him far more than it should have. Because beneath the polished confidence, beneath the expensive suit and carefully constructed image, a fear remained alive. Julian did not fear losing money. He feared losing authorship. He feared a future where people finally understood that the empire he controlled had been built by someone else. And for the first time, that possibility no longer felt distant. 3 days after the Bioinnovation Forum ended, the first requests arrived. They appeared quietly. No headlines. No public accusations. No dramatic confrontations. A licensing verification inquiry reached Sterling Bio from an international research partner preparing to expand a genomic diagnostics program. Another arrived from a manufacturing consortium reviewing intellectual property compliance before approving a new production agreement. Then, a third organization requested clarification regarding foundational patent ownership connected to several activation sequences used across multiple development platforms. Individually, the requests seemed routine. Together, they formed a pattern. The system had begun asking questions. Pause production. Inside Sterling Bio headquarters, legal and compliance teams worked to provide answers. Initially, Julian remained unconcerned. Large corporations received inquiries constantly. He viewed the situation as an administrative inconvenience rather than a threat. Publicly, Sterling Bio kept moving. Yet behind the scenes, delays started appearing in places investors could not see. One research expansion project entered temporary review while ownership documentation was verified. A manufacturing partner postponed final approval of a licensing amendment. A collaborative development initiative requested supplemental patent validation before proceeding. None of these actions stopped Sterling Bio completely. Not yet. But one pilot study paused enrollment while validation ownership was reviewed. A laboratory certification partner suspended deployment of an automated sequencing protocol. A research consortium requested corrected contributor disclosures before continuing collaboration. A scientific journal asked Sterling Bio to clarify whether Maya's foundational methodology had been properly attributed in prior submissions. These were not questions anymore. They were consequences. Run the review. Across the industry, licensing specialists began comparing records. Patent administrators reviewed authorization pathways. Compliance officers examined documentation that had not received close attention in years. The deeper they looked, the more frequently Maya Sterling's name appeared. Her authorship existed inside foundational filings. Her authority appeared throughout activation protocols. Her intellectual property architecture connected directly to technologies generating billions in projected value. The discoveries were factual. They were also impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Maya remained almost entirely absent from public view. She gave no interviews. She issued no public statements. She launched no media campaign. Instead, she continued collaborating with research organizations and maintaining meticulous documentation. The silence worked in her favor. Every question emerging across the industry originated from records, not accusations. From evidence, not emotion. Protect the source. Inside Sterling Bio, Julian's frustration grew. During executive meetings, he demanded faster resolutions. He requested updates. He pushed departments for certainty. Yet certainty proved increasingly difficult to manufacture. One compliance review led to another. One verification request generated additional inquiries. Every answer seemed to uncover new dependencies tied to intellectual property structures created by Maya years earlier. For the first time, Julian encountered a problem his confidence could not solve. Evidence required evidence. Not reputation. Not charisma. Not branding. He had miscalculated. By the end of the month, the consequences became harder to conceal. A regulatory pathway consultant advised delaying 2 product milestones until patent authority was resolved. A clinical trial oversight committee requested written confirmation that every source sequence used in the program had valid licensing clearance. Internal project leaders began preparing contingency plans in case Maya's activation rights became unavailable. For the first time, people inside Sterling Bio were planning around Julian instead of through him. Several international partners delayed negotiations pending ownership clarification. Research organizations requested amended disclosures identifying original scientific contributors. Industry publications began publishing detailed discussions about the history of Sterling Bio's technological foundations. None of the articles accused Julian of wrongdoing. They simply asked increasingly specific questions about authorship, licensing authority, and patent control. The effect was profound. Sterling Bio still possessed buildings, employees, investors, prestige, and public confidence, but the scientific machinery underneath those symbols had begun protecting itself from unauthorized use. Yet the invisible machinery that supported those assets had started shifting beneath the surface. The company's power had always depended on assumptions. Those assumptions were now being tested. And systems have little interest in pride. They only care whether the documentation supports the story being told. As another verification request arrived late that evening, Julian stared at the report sitting on his desk. For years, he had believed control came from owning the company. Now the company itself was demanding proof of something he had spent years pretending never mattered. The source. The collapse did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as absence. 3 weeks after the licensing reviews intensified, Julian Sterling began noticing things that were no longer happening. Calls that once came immediately were returned hours later. Invitations that once appeared automatically stopped arriving. Conversations that once became warmer when he entered a room became shorter instead. Power was not disappearing all at once. It was quietly leaving. Inside Sterling Bio headquarters, executive meetings had changed. Reports still filled conference tables. Forecasts still covered presentation screens. Yet the atmosphere felt different. Questions had replaced assumptions. Verification had replaced trust. During one strategy session, a board representative requested additional documentation regarding foundational patent ownership before approving a major expansion proposal. The request was professional, routine even. Yet Julian recognized what it meant. The room no longer accepted his word as sufficient proof. Provide the documentation. Across the company, departments adjusted to growing uncertainty. Manufacturing partners delayed commitments. Research collaborators requested independent reviews. Licensing discussions slowed. Every process seemed to require another layer of confirmation. The system was protecting itself. Julian found that reality increasingly difficult to control. Meanwhile, industry publications continued examining the origins of Sterling Bio's most valuable technologies. Detailed analyses highlighted Maya Sterling's contributions. Academic researchers referenced her work. Scientific panels discussed her methodologies. The recognition was not coordinated. It was organic, and that made it far more dangerous. For years, Julian had tolerated Maya being respected. What he could not tolerate was Maya being recognized as essential. He had miscalculated. The change extended beyond business relationships. It reached personal ones as well. At an exclusive investor gathering, Julian approached a group that had once welcomed him immediately into conversation. They greeted him politely. Then the discussion shifted elsewhere. Later that evening, a private banker who had spent years anticipating his needs responded with professional neutrality instead of personal enthusiasm. The difference lasted only seconds. Julian noticed it anyway. Silence can reveal more than criticism. No response. Back at headquarters, another subtle shift occurred. The executive assistant who normally rearranged entire schedules at his request began asking whether certain decisions should first be reviewed by compliance teams. Procedures now mattered more than preference. Documentation mattered more than status. Sterling Bio was adapting to risk. Julian suddenly found himself treated like part of that risk. The realization unsettled him more than he admitted. Then came Isabella's turn. For months, she had enjoyed magazine covers, luxury partnerships, and invitations tied directly to her association with Sterling Bio's future. But prestige follows momentum, and momentum was fading. One international luxury brand quietly withdrew from a planned campaign after internal reviews concluded that ongoing intellectual property controversies created unnecessary exposure. Another partnership disappeared days later. Then a major media appearance was postponed indefinitely. A scientific foundation removed her from an upcoming public campaign after reviewers concluded she had promoted research programs without understanding the science behind them. For the first time, Isabella was no longer treated as a future symbol. She was treated as a liability. No public scandal occurred. No dramatic announcement was made. Move it elsewhere. 48 hours later, her representation received 3 separate cancellation notices. A skincare campaign ended. A luxury wellness partnership ended. A biotech lifestyle cover story ended. Different industries. Same reason. Reputation alignment concerns. Isabella finally understood something Maya had recognized from the beginning. Borrowed prestige disappears the moment the source of power is questioned. The admiration surrounding her had never been unconditional. It belonged to the image Julian sold. Once confidence in that image weakened, so did the attention supporting it. By the end of the month, Julian stood alone inside his office overlooking the city he once believed he controlled. Reports covered his desk. Verification notices continued arriving. Partners waited. Investors watched. And for the first time, he confronted the fear that had followed him for years. Not bankruptcy. Not failure. Exposure. The possibility that the world would finally see what he had spent a decade hiding from himself. Sterling Bio's greatest achievement had never been the Sterling name. It had been Maya. And now everyone was beginning to realize it. 2 days before the International Biotech Summit, Julian Sterling requested a private meeting. The message arrived through professional channels, carefully worded and stripped of emotion. He did not demand. He did not threaten. He did not apologize. Instead, he asked for a conversation regarding the future of Sterling Bio. Maya accepted, not because she owed him anything, because the story deserved an ending. The meeting took place inside a private conference suite at a research center nearly 15 miles outside the city. Neutral ground. No journalists. No investors. No audience. When Julian entered the room, he still wore the appearance of a man accustomed to authority. The black suit remained immaculate. The posture remained controlled. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time since Maya had known him, certainty no longer arrived with him. It stayed outside the door. Across the table, Maya placed the red leather lab notebook beside a stack of verified patent records and licensing reviews. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt strangely honest. Julian finally began. He spoke about employees, about shareholders, about research programs that could be disrupted if the conflict continued. He framed the situation as a shared problem requiring a practical solution. Then he suggested a revised licensing agreement, one that would restore stability while allowing both parties to move forward. His language remained calm. His strategy remained familiar. He was still trying to negotiate reality into a shape he could control. Read the patent. Maya opened the notebook slowly and turned to a page protected beneath a transparent archival cover. Beneath it sat the original activation sequence architecture that had become the foundation of Sterling Bio's most valuable technologies. Years of scientific work existed inside those pages. Years of discipline. Years of sacrifice. Years Julian had gradually convinced himself belonged to the company rather than the woman who created them. She slid the notebook across the table. Julian looked at the sequence, then at the authorship record beneath it, then at the licensing chain connected to every review currently threatening his empire. The room became very quiet. Protect the source. Maya spoke for the first time. Her voice remained calm. Precise. You never wanted an heir. Julian looked up, but said nothing. She continued. You wanted a witness. The words settled heavily between them. A witness who could help you pretend the Sterling name created what my mind built. For For the first time, Julian's expression changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but enough. The carefully constructed confidence that had protected him for years revealed a crack underneath. Maya saw it immediately. He had miscalculated. The fear was no longer hidden. It had never been about succession. It had never been about legacy. It had never even been about Isabella. It was about comparison. Julian could not tolerate a world where Maya's brilliance existed independently of him. He needed ownership because ownership allowed him to claim authorship. He needed control because control protected the illusion. Maya closed the notebook. Then she delivered the truth he had spent years avoiding. You thought ownership created genius. Another silence followed. I was the source code. Julian lowered his eyes toward the notebook again. For several seconds, neither spoke. There was nothing left to negotiate. The evidence existed. The reviews existed. The industry had already begun reaching its conclusions. Finally, Julian asked a question so quietly it barely sounded like him. What happens now? Maya stood and collected the notebook. The answer arrived without anger, without triumph, without revenge. Now the truth works without permission. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Julian remained seated at the table, surrounded by documents proving exactly what he had feared for years. The empire still existed. The illusion did not. The ultimate victory isn't watching an empire burn. It's knowing you were the only one who knew how to keep it alive. People often misunderstand power. They imagine it as ownership, as titles, as buildings carrying a family name, as headlines celebrating success. But real power is quieter than that. Real power lives inside the mind that solves problems nobody else can solve. It lives inside the discipline that continues working when applause disappears. It lives inside the knowledge that remains valuable whether anyone chooses to recognize it or not. Julian Sterling spent years believing control came from possession. What the licensing reviews ultimately revealed was something far more uncomfortable. Sterling Bio had never been a machine that ran on ownership. It ran on understanding. Julian owned access to the system. Maya understood how the system functioned. When she stepped away, the difference became visible to everyone. He believed that if he controlled the company, he controlled the legacy. If he controlled the brand, he controlled the future. In the end, reality exposed a truth he could never negotiate away. A name can own a building. A name cannot manufacture genius. That distinction changed everything. Let them remember. 3 months later, the International Biotech Summit opened before a global audience of researchers, innovators, licensing authorities, and scientific leaders. Delegations arrived from universities, private laboratories, and research institutions across the world. New discoveries were announced. New partnerships were formed. New ideas competed for attention. Yet one moment drew particular interest throughout the conference. Maya Sterling stepped onto the main stage wearing a tailored red blazer and a conference badge identifying her as founder and scientific director of the newly established Sterling Devereux Research Institute. The auditorium responded with respectful applause. Not celebrity applause. Not media-driven excitement. Something far more meaningful. Professional recognition. She stood before thousands of people who understood exactly what her work represented. Years earlier, many of them had studied her publications. Some had built careers using methods she developed. Others had followed the licensing reviews that transformed an entire industry conversation about authorship and ownership. Maya looked across the audience and saw neither victory nor revenge. She saw possibility. Open the doors. Her presentation focused on future research initiatives involving genomic diagnostics, ethical licensing structures, and collaborative scientific development. She spoke about innovation. She spoke about responsibility. She spoke about protecting discovery without allowing discovery to become captive to ego. The audience listened carefully. When the presentation ended, the standing ovation arrived naturally. Nothing about it felt forced. Nothing about it felt symbolic. It felt earned. Meanwhile, elsewhere inside the summit complex, security personnel escorted Julian Sterling from a restricted conference area after an international intellectual property review determined he lacked authorization to access materials connected to disputed licensing programs. There was no spectacle, no humiliation, no dramatic scene. Most attendees never even noticed. The conference continued without interruption, and that fact revealed everything. The industry had moved forward. So had Maya. Later that evening, she stood alone for a moment on an elevated terrace overlooking the conference gardens illuminated beneath the evening sky. Conversations drifted through the air below. Researchers discussed projects. Students exchanged ideas. New collaborations were already beginning. Maya rested her hand on the red leather lab notebook she still carried with her. Not as a weapon, not as evidence. As a reminder, the future she once protected for someone else had finally become her own. And for the first time in years, she no longer needed permission to build it. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.